The rain came down in sheets over Portland that October morning, turning Union Station into a chaotic mess of wet coats and hurried footsteps. The air smelled like damp concrete and burnt coffee from the Starbucks kiosk near the ticket counters, where travelers jostled with umbrellas and overstuffed bags. Overhead, the old brass clock ticked toward 8:15, its hands cutting through the gray light streaming from the arched windows. Announcements crackled through the speakers. Train to Seattle, departing platform 3 in 5 minutes, mixing with the low rumble of wheels on tracks and the chatter of strangers who didn't give a damn about anyone else's story. Ava Brooks didn't belong here, not like this. Her auburn hair was a tangled wreck, plastered to her face from the downpour she'd run through to get inside. Her black blazer clung to her shoulders, soaked through, and her high heels, those damn $300 pumps she'd worn to court a dozen times, slipped on the slick tile floor as she shoved past a guy with a dripping backpack. She didn't care that her mascara was probably streaking down her cheeks, or that her lungs burned from sprinting half a mile in the rain. All she cared about was the man she'd seen through the station's glass doors, the one stepping onto that train with a beat-up guitar case slung over his shoulder. "Noah!" she shouted, her voice raw, barely cutting through the noise. Heads turned, some annoyed, some curious, but she didn't stop. Her heel caught on a crack in the floor, and she stumbled, catching herself against a pillar just in time to see the train's doors slide open on platform 3. There he was, Noah Sullivan, his dark hair peeking out from under a worn leather jacket, his gray eyes fixed on the ground like he was already 1,000 miles away. His suitcase sat at his feet, small and battered, like it had seen too many goodbyes. He didn't look back, not yet. And that tore at her worse than the cold seeping into her bones. She'd screwed up. God, she knew it. Last night she'd walked away from Ethan Marshall, her fiancé of 2 years, after catching him laughing about his side chick outside that swanky bar downtown. She'd thrown his diamond ring at him, watched it bounce off his chest and clatter into the gutter, and told him they were done. But it wasn't Ethan's betrayal that had kept her up all night, pacing her high-rise apartment with a bottle of cheap Merlot. It was Noah, the guy she hadn't seen in 20 years until 3 weeks ago, the guy who'd walked back into her life with a faded friendship bracelet and a smile that cracked her world wide open. And now he was leaving, because she'd been too damn stubborn, too scared, to tell him the truth. "Move!" she snapped, shoving past a woman with a stroller, her voice sharper than she meant it to be. The woman huffed something about manners, but Ava was already gone, her legs pumping as she darted through the crowd. The platform loomed ahead, a blur of yellow lines and wet metal, and she could see the train's doors starting to hiss shut. Her heart slammed against her ribs, a wild thing trying to break free. She wasn't going to make it, not unless she ran faster than she ever had in her life. "Noah, wait!" she yelled again, louder this time, her throat burning. A few people stepped aside, probably thinking she was some crazy ex chasing a guy who didn't want her. Maybe they weren't wrong. She hit the platform just as the doors clicked halfway closed, and there he was, standing inside, his back to her. The sight of him, shoulders slumped, guitar case dangling from one hand, hit her like a punch to the gut. He was really going. After everything, after 20 years of promises and silences and second chances, he was walking away. "Noah, don't go!" she screamed, slamming her hands against the glass door as it sealed shut. The sound echoed, a dull thud swallowed by the rain and the hum of the engine. He froze, his head snapping up, and then he turned, slowly, like he couldn't believe what he'd heard. Their eyes locked through the smeared window, and for a split second, the world stopped. Those gray eyes, the ones that used to light up when he handed her a crayon in kindergarten, were red-rimmed now, glistening with something that looked a hell of a lot like tears. His mouth formed her name, Ava, but no sound came through the glass. The train lurched forward, a slow grind of metal on metal, and Ava's knees buckled. "No, please," she begged, pounding the door with her fists, not caring who saw. She ran alongside it, her heels skidding on the wet platform, her hands sliding down the glass as the train picked up speed. "Noah, I love you. I've always loved you. Don't leave me again." Her voice cracked, raw and desperate, loud enough to turn every head on the platform. A kid in a hoodie pulled out his phone to film, but she didn't give a damn. She was losing him. Again. And this time it was her fault. Inside the train, Noah pressed a hand to the window, his face twisting with shock and pain. He looked like he wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. The gap between them widened, 5 feet, 10, 20, and Ava's legs gave out. She sank to her knees, rain pooling around her, soaking her skirt as she watched the train curve around the bend. He was gone. Just like that day 20 years ago when her mom's silver Toyota peeled out of Willow Creek Elementary's parking lot, leaving a 6-year-old Noah sobbing on the sidewalk with 2 friendship bracelets clutched in his fists. Her chest heaved, sobs tearing out of her as she stared at the empty tracks. The rain hammered down, cold and relentless, washing away the last shred of hope she'd clung to. She'd had her chance. 3 weeks of stolen coffees and late-night talks with Noah, and she'd blown it. Too afraid to leave Ethan's perfect little world, too stuck in her own head to see what was right in front of her. And now he was gone, probably thinking she'd chosen someone else all over again. "Miss, you okay?" A voice cut through the haze. She looked up, blinking through the water streaming down her face, and saw an older guy in a yellow raincoat. Some station worker, maybe, peering down at her with a frown. His gray beard was dripping, and he held out a hand like she was a stray dog he didn't know how to handle. She didn't take it. "No," she croaked, pushing herself up, her palms stinging from the rough concrete. "I'm not okay." She staggered to her feet, her blazer sagging off one shoulder, and stared at the tracks like they might magically bring him back. The worker muttered something about coffee and shuffled off, leaving her alone with the rain and the ghosts of what could have been, and then the screech of brakes, a sharp, piercing sound that jolted her out of her misery. She spun around, heart leaping into her throat, and saw the train shudder to a stop halfway down the platform. People grumbled, craning their necks, but Ava didn't wait to figure out why. She took off running again, her shoes slapping the wet ground, hope clawing its way back into her chest. The doors hissed open, and there he was, Noah, stepping out, his guitar case banging against his leg as he scanned the platform. His jacket was soaked, his hair a mess, but when he saw her, his whole face changed. Relief, anger, love, all of it crashed together in those gray eyes, and he started toward her, his boots pounding the concrete. "Ava, what the hell?" he started, his voice rough, but she didn't let him finish. She threw herself at him, slamming into his chest so hard he stumbled back a step. Her arms wrapped around him, fingers digging into his jacket, and she buried her face against his shoulder, sobbing like a kid who'd lost everything and found it again. "I'm sorry," she choked out, her words muffled against him. "I'm so sorry, Noah. I was an idiot. I love you. I've loved you since we were 6, and I was too damn stupid to see it. Don't go. Please don't go." He stood there, rigid for a second, like he didn't trust this wasn't some cruel trick. Then his arms came around her, tight and fierce, and she felt his breath hitch against her hair. "You mean that?" he asked, his voice low, shaky. "Because I've waited 20 years, Ava, and I can't do this if you're just running from him." She pulled back just enough to look at him, rain dripping off her nose, her hands framing his face. His stubble scratched her palms, and those eyes, God, those eyes, searched hers like they were begging for the truth. "It's not about Ethan," she said, her voice steady despite the tears. "It's about you. It's always been you. I was too blind, too scared. But I'm here now, "You're my home, Noah. Please." For a long moment, he just stared at her, rain streaking down his face, mixing with the tears he wasn't bothering to hide. Then he laughed, a rough, broken sound that turned into a grin, and pulled her back into him, kissing her hard. It wasn't gentle or sweet. It was 20 years of waiting, of hurting, of hoping, all crashing together under the station's flickering lights. Her fingers tangled in his wet hair, and she kissed him back, tasting salt and rain and everything she'd almost lost. The crowd around them clapped, some half-assed applause from strangers who'd caught the tail end of their drama. But Ava didn't care. She had him. Noah Sullivan, the boy who'd shared his crayons and wiped her spilled juice, the man who'd kept a promise she'd forgotten until it was almost too late. When they finally broke apart, foreheads pressed together, he reached into his pocket and pulled out that old friendship bracelet. Green and yellow threads faded, but still holding strong. "Still got mine," he said, his voice hoarse. "You?" She smiled through her tears, nodding toward the purse slung over her shoulder. "Always." He took her hand, lacing their fingers together, and they stood there, soaked and shivering, as the rain slowed to a drizzle. The train rolled off without him, its whistle fading into the distance, but neither of them looked back. They'd lost each other once, 20 years ago, in a small-town classroom in Willow Creek. This time, they weren't letting go. Flashback, 20 years earlier. The sun poured through the windows of Willow Creek Elementary, lighting up the kindergarten room where a 6-year-old Ava sat alone, her brown eyes glaring at a broken crayon. Noah, all messy hair and untucked shirt, slid into the seat beside her, holding out a perfect red one. "You can have mine," he said, simple as that, and she scowled but took it anyway. That was the start. The first thread of a promise that had stretched across decades, waiting for this rainy morning to come full circle. Hey, if that train station showdown got your heart racing, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss how Ava and Noah got here. Drop a rainy days in the comments if you think true love's worth chasing. Literally. He pulled one hand out of his pocket, and there it was, dangling between his fingers like a relic from a time capsule. A faded friendship bracelet, green and yellow threads worn thin, but still knotted together after all these years. Ava's breath caught, her hand flying to her chest like she could hold her heart in place. She'd made one just like it, blue and purple, her favorite colors, back in that kindergarten room, the day before her mom yanked her out of Willow Creek and into a new life she hadn't asked for. "You kept it?" she whispered, stepping closer, close enough to smell the faint leather of his jacket and the cedarwood cologne clinging to his shirt. "Never could toss it," Noah said, his voice low, almost shy. "Figured it was the one thing I had left of you." His eyes searched hers, like he was waiting for her to laugh it off or pull away. But she didn't. She couldn't. That bracelet. It was a promise, a silly kid's vow scribbled in marker on construction paper, but it hit her now like a freight train. 20 years, and he'd carried it with him. Before she could find words, the band slid into a slower tune. "Can't Help Falling in Love," all soft drums and mellow guitar, and the crowd shifted, couples pairing off on the dance floor. Noah glanced over his shoulder, then back at her, a question in his eyes. "Dance with me?" he asked, holding out a hand. His fingers were calloused from years of strumming, a little unsteady, like he half expected her to say no. Ava hesitated, her gaze flicking to Ethan, still deep in his networking spiel by the bar. He hadn't looked her way in 10 minutes, too busy sealing some deal to notice her slipping out of his orbit. She should have said no, should have stayed in her lane, played the good fiancé. But something in Noah's quiet offer pulled her in, a lifeline she didn't know she needed. "Yeah," she said, sliding her hand into his. "Okay." His grip was warm, firm, and he led her onto the floor with that same easy stride she remembered from the playground. The kid who'd walk her to her mom's car every day, rain or shine. The lights dimmed, strings of Edison bulbs casting a golden glow over the room, and they fell into step, her free hand resting on his shoulder, his on her waist. It was awkward at first. She hadn't slow danced since prom, and he wasn't exactly Fred Astaire, but then their rhythm clicked, like they'd done this 1,000 times before. "You're taller than I remember," she said, tilting her head up to meet his eyes. He was close now, close enough that she could see the faint scar above his eyebrow, probably from some dumb stunt he'd pulled as a kid. "You're prettier than I pictured," he shot back, grinning when she rolled her eyes. "What? I was 6. My imagination only went so far." "Flatterer," she said. But she was smiling too, a real one that made her cheeks ache. The music wrapped around them, Elvis's voice crooning through the speakers, and for a minute it was just them. No Ethan, no diamond bracelets, no 20 years of silence. She could feel the bracelet in his pocket brushing against her hip as they swayed, a tiny thread tying them back to Willow Creek. "Still stubborn as hell?" he asked, his tone teasing but soft, like he already knew the answer. "Still playing hero?" she countered, thinking of all the times he'd swooped in back then, wiping up her spilled juice, chasing off Tommy Grayson when he'd yanked her pigtails. He'd been her shadow, her shield, and she'd pushed him away every time, too proud to admit she liked it. "Only for you," he said, and there was something in his voice, something raw, that made her stomach flip. Their eyes locked, and the room blurred out, the chatter and clinking glasses fading to static. She saw it then. The kid who'd stood up to bullies for her, the guy who'd kept that damn bracelet through 2 decades of God knows what. And she felt it too, a pull she couldn't name, tugging at the cracks in the perfect life she'd built. The song hit its final notes, and Ava didn't want it to end. Not this, not them. But before she could say anything, a hand clamped down on her shoulder, firm and possessive, yanking her back to reality. She turned, and there was Ethan. His hazel eyes narrowed, his smile tight and practiced, the one he used when he was pissed, but didn't want to show it. "Mind if I cut in?" he said, his voice smooth as silk, but edged with something hard. He didn't wait for an answer, sliding his arm around Ava's waist and pulling her away from Noah like she was a prize he'd misplaced. The warmth of Noah's touch vanished, replaced by Ethan's cologne, sharp, expensive, suffocating. Noah stepped back, hands jamming into his pockets again, his jaw tight. "Didn't mean to step on any toes," he said, his tone even but clipped. His eyes flicked to Ava, a question there. "You okay with this?" But she couldn't answer, not with Ethan's grip anchoring her in place. "No harm done," Ethan said, flashing that salesman grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Just reclaiming my fiancé. You're with the band, right? Good set. Kept the crowd happy." It was a dismissal, casual but cutting, and Ava felt her cheeks burn. She hated how he talked down to people, hated how he made it sound like Noah was just hired help. "Thanks," Noah said, nodding stiffly. He glanced at Ava one last time, something unreadable passing over his face, disappointment maybe, or resignation, then turned back to the stage, where the bassist was waving him over for the next song. Ethan spun her around, pulling her into a dance that felt more like a performance than anything real. "Who's the guy?" he asked, his voice low, casual in a way that wasn't casual at all. His hand tightened on her hip, just enough to let her know he'd noticed more than he was letting on. "Old friend," she said, keeping her tone light, even as her pulse raced. "From Willow Creek. Haven't seen him in years." "Huh," Ethan said, his eyes scanning the room like he was already moving on to the next deal. "Looked pretty cozy for haven't seen in years." "Ethan, don't," she snapped, sharper than she meant to. He raised an eyebrow, surprised, but didn't push it. Not here, not with half of Portland's elite watching. Instead, he smirked and twirled her under his arm, a move so smooth it could have been choreographed. She played along, because that's what you did with Ethan. Kept the show going. But as he steered her across the floor, her eyes found Noah again. He was back on stage, strumming a fast riff, his head down but his shoulders tense. The bracelet was still in his pocket. She could see the faint outline. And it hit her like a brick. He'd kept it all this time, while she'd buried hers in a box somewhere, along with every memory of him. 20 years, and he'd held on to her when she'd let him go. The song ended, applause rippling through the room, and Ava pulled away from Ethan, muttering something about needing air. He let her go, already distracted by a guy in a pinstripe suit waving him over. She slipped out to the balcony, the cool night air hitting her face like a slap, and leaned against the railing, her hands shaking. Below, Portland glittered. Neon signs, traffic lights, the Willamette River slicing through it all. But her mind was stuck on Noah, on that dance, on the weight of that bracelet against her side. She didn't hear the door open behind her, didn't notice the party spilling out until it was too late to hide the mess in her head. All she knew was that seeing him again had cracked something open, something she'd locked away years ago, and she wasn't sure she could shove it back down. Hey, if that dance floor reunion got your heart thumping, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss what's next for Ava and Noah. Drop an old promises in the comments if you think fate's got a funny way of showing up right on time. The Portland Convention Center buzzed with that fake warmth vibe only a charity gala could pull off. White tablecloths, overpriced appetizers, and a crowd of suits pretending they cared about the cause more than the tax write-off. It was late September, a week after Lauren's wedding, and the air carried a crisp edge that sneaked in through the open terrace doors, mixing with the smell of roasted coffee and mini quiches from the catering trays. Ava Brooks stood near a high-top table, swirling a glass of Chardonnay she didn't plan to drink. Her navy blazer swapped for a sleek black dress that screamed successful lawyer louder than she felt tonight. Ethan Marshall, her fiancé, was by her side, his arms slung around her waist like a claim staked in the ground, his laugh too loud as he schmoozed some city council guy about zoning permits. She'd been on edge all week, ever since that dance with Noah Sullivan at the wedding, the way his hand felt on her back, the faded bracelet he'd pulled out like a time machine. It had stuck with her, nagging at the edges of her mind while she prepped briefs and smiled through Ethan's endless dinner plans. She hadn't told him about Noah, not the full story anyway, just said he was an old friend from Willow Creek. Ethan didn't ask, didn't care, and that should have been a relief. Instead, it gnawed at her, a quiet ache she couldn't name. The stage lights flickered on, snapping her out of her spiral, and a ripple of polite applause spread through the room as the MC, a perky blonde in a red dress, took the mic. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our musical guest of the evening, local talent Noah Sullivan and his band. Ava's head jerked up so fast her neck twinged, her glass wobbling in her hand. Noah? Here? Sure enough, there he was, climbing onto the low stage with that beat-up guitar case, his dark hair falling into his eyes as he adjusted the mic stand. He wore a flannel shirt over a plain tee, sleeves rolled up, looking like he'd wandered in from a dive bar instead of a black tie event. The drummer and bassist followed, setting up with the kind of easy rhythm that said they'd done this 100 times. Ava's heart kicked up a notch, and she set her glass down before Ethan noticed her grip tightening. "What's this guy's deal?" Ethan muttered, leaning close, his breath hot with whiskey. "Looks like he's here to bust tables, not play." "He's good," Ava said, sharper than she meant to, her eyes glued to Noah as he strummed a few test chords. "Give him a chance." Ethan snorted, but he didn't push it, not yet. The band launched into their first song, a mellow acoustic number with a beat that pulled the crowd in despite themselves. Noah's voice rolled out, rough but warm, like a fire crackling on a cold night, and Ava felt it in her chest, every note, every word. He wasn't singing anything flashy, just a story about small-town summers and promises made under oak trees, but it hit her hard. She could see Willow Creek in it, the playground swings, the dusty classroom, the way he'd looked at her like she was the only thing that mattered. Halfway through the set, he switched to a slower tune, his fingers picking out a haunting melody that made the room quiet down. "This one's called Threads," he said into the mic, his voice low, almost hesitant. "Wrote it a while back, about holding on to something you're not sure you should." His eyes flicked up, finding hers across the sea of tables, and Ava's breath hitched. The lyrics spilled out, green and yellow, tied up tight, carried you through every night. And she knew it was about her, about that damn bracelet he'd kept all these years. The crowd was hooked, heads nodding, a few older folks wiping their eyes, but Ava barely noticed. She was back in that kindergarten room, 6 years old, watching him weave those threads with his clumsy little hands, promising forever while she rolled her eyes and secretly loved it. Ethan shifted beside her, his arm tightening, and she realized he was watching her watch Noah, his jaw set in a way that spelled trouble. When the song ended, applause broke out, louder this time, genuine, and Noah gave a small nod, stepping back as the bassist took over for a quick riff. Ethan clapped too, but it was slow, deliberate, the kind of clap that said he was about to make a point. "Not bad," he said, loud enough for the table next to them to hear. "For a guy who probably lives in his mom's basement. What's he think? This is going to get him a record deal?" A few people chuckled, the nervous kind, and Ava's stomach dropped. "Ethan, stop!" she hissed, turning to face him, her voice low but fierce. "He's talented, don't be an ass." "Relax, babe," he said, smirking, but his eyes were cold. "Just saying what everyone's thinking. Guy's a charity case, literally." He raised his glass to the council guy, who laughed like it was a great joke, and Ava felt heat crawl up her neck. She glanced at the stage. Noah was looking their way now, his expression unreadable, but she saw the way his hand tightened on the guitar neck. The set wrapped up, and Noah hopped off the stage, heading for the bar with his bandmates. Ava didn't think. She just moved, pulling free of Ethan's grip with a muttered, "I need a drink," that he didn't bother to question. She caught up to Noah by the bar, where he was nursing a beer, his back to the room like he could block out the whole damn gala. "Hey," she said, sliding onto the stool next to him. "That was incredible." He turned, surprised, then gave her that half-smile she remembered, warm but guarded. "Thanks. Didn't expect to see you here." "Firm's a sponsor," she said, nodding toward the banner with her company's logo. "Didn't expect you either. That song, Threads, it's about you," he finished, his voice quiet, eyes dropping to the bottle in his hand. "Yeah," she swallowed, her throat tight. "Noah, Nice performance," Ethan's voice cut in, smooth and loud as he appeared behind her, clapping Noah on the shoulder like they were buddies. "Really brought the room down. Hope they're raising money for tissues, too." The bartender smirked, and a couple nearby laughed, but Noah just stiffened, his jaw clenching. "Glad you liked it," he said, flat, not taking the bait. He took a swig of his beer, his eyes flicking to Ava, then away. Ethan wasn't done. "So, what's the plan, man? Keep playing these gigs till you're 40? Or you think some label's gonna scoop up a small-town strummer with a sob story?" "Ethan, enough!" Ava snapped, standing up so fast her stool scraped the floor. Heads turned, and she felt the room's eyes on her, but she didn't care. "What the hell's your problem?" Just having fun, babe, he said, raising his hands like she was overreacting. Guys gotta have thick skin in this game, right? He looked at Noah, daring him to bite back, but Noah just shook his head, setting his bottle down. Catch you later, Ava, he said, his voice steady but tight, and walked off, disappearing into the crowd toward the exit. She watched him go, her chest aching, and turned on Ethan, her fists balled at her sides. You're a jerk, she said low and furious. He didn't deserve that. Ethan rolled his eyes, grabbing her elbow to steer her back to the table. Come on, don't make a scene. He's a big boy. He'll live. She yanked her arm free, glaring at him. Maybe you should have thought about that before you opened your mouth. She stormed off, not to their table but to the terrace, needing air, needing space from the man she was supposed to marry in 6 months. Outside, the night was cool, the city lights smudging through a thin layer of fog rolling in off the river. She leaned against the railing, her breath fogging in the air, and tried to shake the image of Noah's face. Hurt, but holding it together. She'd wanted to run after him, tell him Ethan was full of crap. But what would that even fix? He'd still be the guy with a guitar and a dream. And she'd still be... what? Ethan's trophy? The next morning, back at her sleek downtown office, Ava was still rattled. Her focus shot as she stared at a contract she'd read 3 times without registering a word. Maggie, her assistant, 5 feet of sass with a pixie cut and a coffee addiction, barged in, holding a small package. This came for you, she said, tossing it onto Ava's desk with a grin. No return address, mysterious stranger vibes. Ava frowned, tearing it open, and her heart stopped. Inside was a CD, unmarked except for a scrawled A on the case in black Sharpie. She popped it into her laptop, her hands shaky, and Noah's voice filled the room. Low, raw, singing a song she hadn't heard last night. 20 years waiting, threads wearing thin. You forgot me, but I can't begin. It was about her, about them, and it cut deeper than anything he'd played live. Maggie peeked over her shoulder, eyebrows shooting up. Who's this guy? Sounds like he's got it bad. Old friend, Ava mumbled, but her voice cracked, and Maggie didn't buy it for a second. Uh-huh, she said, smirking. Sure, spill later. I've got a depot to prep. She ducked out, leaving Ava alone with the music and a memory that hit like a slap. Her 8th birthday, when Noah promised to come but didn't, too scared of the other kids teasing. She'd cried that night, told herself she didn't need him, and built a wall he'd spent 20 years trying to climb. She sank into her chair, replaying the CD, tears stinging her eyes as the last note faded. Ethan's words echoed. Small-town strummer with a sob story. And she hated how they'd landed, hated how she'd let them. Noah deserved better. But what did she deserve? She pulled the diamond bracelet off her wrist, staring at it like it was a handcuff, and wondered how long she could keep pretending she was happy with the life she'd chosen. Hey, if Ethan's cheap shot and that CD got you fired up, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss Ava's next move. Drop a broken strings in the comments if you're Team Noah. Let's see how this mess plays out. The Sapphire Room was one of those upscale Portland bars that reeked of ambition. Polished mahogany walls, dim Edison bulbs dangling from the ceiling, and a playlist of jazzy covers that made you feel like you were in a movie about rich people doing shady things. It was early October, a Thursday night, and the place was packed with Ethan Marshall's crew, suits from his real estate firm, a few buddies from his frat days, and some hangers-on who'd shown up for the free booze. Ava Brooks stood outside, her black coat pulled tight against the drizzle, clutching a small gift box with a vintage Rolex inside. She'd spent weeks tracking it down for Ethan's bachelor party, a peace offering after their blowout at the gala last week, when he'd humiliated Noah in front of half the city's elite. She still hadn't shaken that night. The way Noah's song from that CD had wormed into her head, playing on repeat every time she closed her eyes. Ethan had brushed off her anger like it was nothing, promising to play nice next time, but his smug grin said he didn't mean it. She'd let it slide, because that's what you did with Ethan, right? Kept the peace, kept the plan on track. 6 months to the wedding, venue booked, invites half designed. It was all set. So why did her stomach feel like a knot she couldn't untie? The rain picked up, tapping against the bar's big windows, and Ava took a deep breath, pushing through the revolving door. Inside, it was warm and loud. Laughter, clinking glasses, the hum of a dozen conversations overlapping. She scanned the private room in the back, expecting to see Ethan holding court, but it was mostly empty, just a few stragglers nursing beers. She frowned, checking her phone. No texts, no heads up he'd moved the party. Typical. "Hey, you seen Ethan?" she asked a guy in a too-tight blazer, one of his junior associates she vaguely recognized. He smirked, jerking his thumb toward the side exit. "Out back, smoking with Mark. Said he needed air." Ava nodded, heading for the door, the Rolex box digging into her palm. The alley behind the bar was narrow, lined with overflowing dumpsters and a flickering street lamp that buzzed like a dying fly. She stepped out, the rain turning her hair into a damp mess, and froze when she heard Ethan's laugh. Sharp, careless, the one he used when he thought he was untouchable. "Chloe's still texting me," he was saying, his voice carrying over the patter of rain on the awning. "Can you believe it? After 6 months, she's still begging for round 2. Ava's heart stopped, her boots rooted to the wet pavement. She pressed herself against the brick wall, out of sight, as Mark, Ethan's best man, a beefy guy with a buzz cut, groaned loud enough to hear. "Dude, you gotta cut that off," Mark said, his tone half exasperated, half amused. "You're engaged to Ava now. This isn't college anymore." Ethan laughed again, colder this time, and she could picture him flicking ash from his cigarette, that smug tilt to his head. "Why? Chloe knows the deal. She's fun, no strings. Ava's the real prize. Smart, gorgeous, looks damn good on my arm. The board loves her. Besides, she's not going anywhere. Too practical to ditch me now." Ava's stomach churned, bile rising in her throat. She gripped the Rolex box so hard the edges bit into her skin, her breath shallow and fast. Mark muttered something she couldn't catch, but Ethan kept going, his voice dripping with arrogance. "She'll never find out. Wedding's locked in. Press is eating it up. What's she gonna do, throw away 2 years over a fling?" The box slipped from her hands, hitting the ground with a dull thud that echoed in the alley. Ethan and Mark spun around, their faces slack with shock under the street lamp's yellow glow. Ethan's cigarette dangled from his lips, ash crumbling onto his pristine shirt. And for once, he didn't have that slick comeback ready. "Ava," he started, stepping toward her, but she held up a hand, her voice cutting through the rain like a blade. "Don't," she said, trembling but steady. "Don't you dare." "Baby, listen," he said, dropping the cigarette and crushing it under his heel, his hands out like he could smooth this over. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think?" she snapped, her voice rising, tears burning her eyes but not falling. Not yet. "I just heard you, Ethan. Chloe, 6 months? You've been screwing around our entire engagement, and I'm what? A trophy for your damn boardroom?" He flinched, but the mask slid back on fast, calm, controlled. The salesman pitch he'd perfected. "You're overreacting, Ava. It was a mistake, a dumb fling. It didn't mean anything." "A mistake." She laughed, bitter and broken, the sound bouncing off the wet bricks. "A mistake is forgetting my birthday, not sleeping with someone else for half a year while I'm picking out your tux." Mark shifted, looking like he'd rather be anywhere else. But Ethan stepped closer, his voice dropping low, urgent. "Let's talk inside, okay? Private. I messed up. I know I did, but we can fix this. We can think about it. The wedding, our families, everything we've built." "Everything you've built," she cut in, yanking the diamond bracelet off her wrist and hurling it at him. It hit his chest, clattering to the pavement, and his eyes widened like she'd slapped him. "I was just a prop to you, Ethan. A prize to parade around. You never loved me. You loved what I could do for you." "That's not true," he said. And for a second she saw something crack in his face. Panic, maybe even guilt. He dropped to one knee, rain soaking his slacks, and grabbed her hand. "Ava, I need you. My family. They'll cut me off if this falls apart. I screwed up because I'm drowning in their expectations, but I swear I'll end it with her. Please." She stared down at him, rain streaking his perfect hair, his hazel eyes pleading in a way she'd never seen. Part of her wanted to believe him, wanted the easy out, the life she'd planned. But then she saw Noah's face in her mind, that quiet hurt at the gala, the bracelet he'd kept when she'd thrown hers away. Ethan's grip felt like a shackle, not a lifeline, and she pulled free, stepping back. "No," she said, her voice steady now, cutting through the drizzle. "You don't get to fix this. We're done." "Ava, don't," he started, scrambling up, but she turned and walked away, her boots splashing through puddles, leaving him calling after her in the rain. The Rolex lay abandoned by the dumpster, a $2,000 apology he didn't deserve, and she didn't look back. By the time she got home, her high-rise apartment felt too big, too quiet, the city lights smearing through the floor-to-ceiling windows like a watercolor gone wrong. She kicked off her boots, leaving them in a heap by the door, and sank onto the couch, her coat still dripping. Her hands shook as she pulled out her phone, scrolling to Noah's CD on her laptop. 20 years waiting, threads wearing thin, and let it play, his voice filling the emptiness she'd ignored for too long. She needed answers, not from Ethan, not from Noah, but from herself. She grabbed her keys and drove to her mom's house in the suburbs, the rain slowing to a mist as she pulled into the driveway of the old craftsman she'd grown up in after Willow Creek. Ava Brooks was in the kitchen, stirring a pot of soup, her gray hair tied back, when Ava burst in, soaked and wild-eyed. "Sweetheart?" Ellen said, setting the spoon down, her face creasing with worry. "What's wrong?" "Everything," Ava said, her voice breaking, and then the tears came. Hot, messy, unstoppable. Ellen pulled her into a hug, letting her sob against her sweater, and when Ava finally calmed down, she spilled it all. Ethan, Noah, the gala, the alley. Ellen listened, nodding, then led her upstairs to the attic without a word. The attic smelled like cedar and old paper, dust motes dancing in the beam of a single bulb. Ellen rummaged through a stack of boxes, pulling out a shoebox covered in faded flower stickers, Ava's childhood stuff. "Found this a while back," Ellen said, handing it over. "Thought you might need it someday." Ava opened it, her fingers trembling. Crayon drawings, a cracked plastic tiara, her first pair of glasses. And then, tucked under a report card, a sealed envelope with her name in her dad's blocky handwriting. Her breath caught. She hadn't seen that scrawl since he died when she was 12, a heart attack that had left her and Ellen reeling. "Go on," Ellen said softly, wiping her own eyes. "He wrote it for you, said to give it to you when the time was right." Ava tore it open, unfolding the yellowed paper, and read, "My Ava, one day you'll find someone who sees you, really sees you. Don't settle for less. Don't let fear choose for you. Trust your heart. It knows the way home. Love, Dad." The words blurred as tears hit the page, and she pressed it to her chest, a sob choking out. Ellen knelt beside her, voice shaky. I pushed you away from Noah back then. Thought he'd hold you back from something bigger. I was wrong, honey. I'm so sorry." Ava shook her head, wiping her face. "It's not your fault. I've been running from him, from me, for years." She thought of that birthday Noah missed, how she'd built a wall because it hurt too much to need him, how she'd chosen Ethan because he was safe, not real. She drove back to her apartment at dawn, the city waking up under a gray sky, and sat on her couch with the letter and the CD. Ethan's betrayal had cracked her world open, but it was her dad's words and Noah's voice that broke it apart. She wasn't Ethan's prize, wasn't the girl who'd pushed Noah away anymore. She was Ava Brooks, and for the first time in years, she knew what she wanted. But when she called Maggie later that morning, desperate to find Noah, her assistant's voice was grim. "He's gone, Ava. Left a note at the cafe. Said he's done waiting." Her heart sank, the room spinning. She'd figured it out too late. Again. And now she had to find him before he slipped away for good. Hey, if Ethan's fall and that letter hit you hard, smash that subscribe button so you don't miss Ava's chase for Noah. Drop a heartbreak rain in the comments if you felt her world shatter. Let's see if she can fix it. The Blue Moon Cafe sat quiet that rainy October morning, a stark contrast to its usual buzz of hipsters and late-night stragglers. The Portland drizzle painted the windows in streaks, blurring the neon open sign that flickered like it was on its last legs. Inside, the air smelled of burnt espresso and cinnamon rolls nobody'd touched, the kind of heavy stillness that settles in when something's gone wrong. Ava Brooks pushed through the door, her boots squeaking on the worn wood floor, her coat dripping a trail behind her. She hadn't slept, hadn't even changed out of the black dress from last night's showdown with Ethan. Her auburn hair hung in damp clumps, and her eyes, red from crying over her dad's letter, darted around the empty room like she could will Noah Sullivan to appear. She'd called Maggie at dawn, voice cracking as she asked her to track him down. After Ethan's betrayal and that attic revelation, Ava knew she couldn't let Noah slip away. Not again. Maggie'd grumbled about needing coffee first, but came through, texting her an hour ago. "Blue Moon, he's been crashing there after gigs. Hurry." Now Ava was here, heart hammering, but the place felt like a ghost town. No band gear, no Noah, just a barista wiping down the counter with a rag that had seen better days. "Hey," Ava said, her voice hoarse as she stepped up to the counter. The barista, mid-20s, nose ring, tattoos snaking up her arm, looked up, eyebrows lifting at the mess standing in front of her. "Noah Sullivan. You seen him? He plays here sometimes." The barista, Jess, her name tag said, frowned, setting the rag down. "You're Ava, right?" Ava blinked, thrown. "Yeah, how'd you—" "He left this," Jess said, reaching under the counter and pulling out a folded piece of paper, creased and smudged like it had been handled too much. "Said to give it to you if you showed up. Figured you might." Ava's stomach dropped, her fingers trembling as she took the note. Noah's handwriting, sloppy, all caps, stared back at her. "Ava, I'm done waiting. Can't keep hurting for something that's never gonna happen. Take care." No goodbye, no address, just 6 words that hit like a punch to the gut. She read it again, then again, the paper crinkling in her grip, and looked up at Jess, desperation clawing at her throat. "When?" she asked, barely a whisper. "When did he leave?" "Last night," Jess said, leaning on the counter, her voice softening. "Came in after his gig, packed his stuff, said he was moving on. Looked like hell, kept muttering about promises and how he's an idiot for believing them." Ava's knees wobbled, and she grabbed the counter to steady herself. "Did he say where? Please, I need to find him." Jess shook her head, pity flickering in her eyes. "Didn't say. Just grabbed his guitar and took off. Said something about starting over, sounded final. The room spun, the cinnamon roll smell turning sour in her nose. He was gone, really gone. And it was her fault. She danced with him, listened to his songs, let him back into her heart, but hadn't told him what he needed to hear. Too scared, too stuck in Ethan's orbit, and now Noah thought she'd picked someone else. Again. She stumbled to a stool, sinking onto it, the note crumpled in her fist. "I gotta go," she muttered, more to herself than Jess, and bolted out the door, the bell jangling behind her. Her phone buzzed as she hit the sidewalk. Maggie, probably with more bad news. She answered, rain soaking her coat, her voice shaking. "He's gone, Mags. Left a note. Said he's done." "Shit," Maggie said, the line crackling with her sigh. "Okay, stay calm. I called his bassist, Jake. Took some yelling, but he spilled. Noah's heading back to Willow Creek, where it all started," he said, "probably catching a train." "Union Station," Ava breathed, already running toward her car parked 2 blocks down. "He's at Union Station." "Girl, you better haul ass," Maggie said. "Trains to Salem leave every hour. He could be on one already." Ava hung up, her boots splashing through puddles, the rain cold against her face, but not enough to numb the panic. She slid into her Audi, hands fumbling with the keys, and peeled out, tires screeching on wet asphalt. The drive to Union Station was a blur. Red lights she barely stopped for, horns blaring as she cut through traffic, her mind racing faster than the car. She saw Noah's face at the gala, hurt but holding it in, heard his voice on that CD. "You forgot me, but I can't begin," and hated herself for letting him think she didn't care. The station loomed ahead, its brick facade slick with rain, and she slammed into a parking spot, not bothering to check if it was legal. She ran inside, the same chaos from that flash-forward morning hitting her, wet coats, rolling suitcases, the burnt coffee stink from Starbucks. The clock above the ticket counters read 9:45, and the overhead speaker crackled. "Train to Salem, departing platform 2 in 10 minutes. Salem was the closest stop to Willow Creek. He had to be on it. "Noah!" she shouted, shoving through the crowd, her voice lost in the din. People glared, a guy with a briefcase muttering, "Crazy lady," but she didn't care. She hit platform 2, the train already boarding, its silver cars gleaming under the station lights. Her eyes scanned the passengers, business types, a mom with a stroller, an old guy with a cane. But no Noah, no leather jacket, no guitar case. Then she saw him, near the far end, stepping onto the last car, his head down, suitcase in one hand, guitar slung over his shoulder. "Noah!" she yelled, louder this time, her throat raw as she sprinted down the platform, her boots slipping on the wet concrete. He didn't hear, or didn't want to, and disappeared inside just as the doors started to hiss shut. "No! Wait!" She reached the car, banging on the glass with both fists, hard enough to sting her palms. "Noah, please!" The doors locked, a sharp click that echoed in her chest, and she pressed her hands against the window, peering through the rain-smeared pane. He was there, standing in the aisle, his back to her, shoulders slumped like he'd given up. "Noah!" she screamed, pounding again, and this time he turned. His gray eyes met hers through the glass, wide with shock, then narrowing with something darker. Hurt, maybe, or anger. His mouth opened, forming her name, Ava, but the sound didn't reach her. The train lurched, a slow grind of metal, and she ran alongside it, her boots slapping the platform, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry. I love you. Don't go. Please, don't go." He pressed a hand to the window, his face twisting, confusion, pain, a flicker of hope. But he didn't move for the door. The train picked up speed, pulling away, and Ava's legs burned as she chased it, her hands sliding down the glass. "Noah!" she yelled, one last desperate plea. But the car curved around the bend, his figure shrinking until it vanished into the gray. Her knees buckled, and she sank to the platform, rain pooling around her, soaking her dress as sobs tore out of her chest. The crowd stared, some filming, some whispering, but she didn't give a damn. He was gone, slipping through her fingers like he had 20 years ago, when her mom's car peeled out of Willow Creek and left him crying on the sidewalk. She'd been too late then, too young to fight it. But this time, this was on her. Every second she'd wasted with Ethan, every moment she'd held back with Noah. "Miss, you all right?" A voice cut through, soft but firm. She looked up, blinking through tears and rain, and saw a station worker, an older guy, bald, yellow raincoat dripping, crouching beside her. His brown eyes crinkled with concern, and he held out a hand, steady and weathered. "No," she croaked, shaking her head, her voice barely audible over the rain. "I lost him." He nodded, like he'd heard that story before, and helped her up, his grip strong under her elbow. "Come on, let's get you out of this mess. Coffee's on me." She let him lead her back inside, her legs numb, her coat heavy with water. The station buzzed around her, announcements, footsteps, life moving on. But she felt stuck, replaying that last look in Noah's eyes. He'd seen her, heard her, but he hadn't stayed. Maybe he didn't believe her. Maybe he couldn't. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, and she fished it out with shaky hands. Maggie again. "Ava, you find him?" Her assistant's voice crackled through, sharp with worry. "He's gone," Ava said, her voice breaking. "Train to Salem. I got here too late." "Damn it," Maggie muttered, then paused. "Jake said something else. Noah's not staying in Salem. He's going back to Willow Creek to that old school. Said it's where he needs to be." Ava's breath caught, a spark of hope flickering through the fog. Willow Creek Elementary, the classroom where it all started, where he'd made that promise she'd forgotten until now. "I'm going," she said, already moving toward the ticket counter, her boots squeaking again. "I have to." "Ava, you're a wreck. Slow down," Maggie said, but Ava cut her off. "No, I've slowed down too long." She hung up, shoving the phone in her pocket, and bought a ticket for the next train to Salem, an hour away. She'd drive from there, 40 minutes to Willow Creek, maybe less if she floored it. She didn't know if he'd be there, didn't know if he'd even listen, but she had to try. She'd lost him once as a kid, lost him again today, and she wasn't letting it happen a third time, not without a fight. She sank onto a bench, the note still crumpled in her hand, and stared at the tracks, rain tapping the windows like a countdown. Noah was out there, hurting, thinking she didn't want him, and she'd never hated herself more. But Willow Creek was her last shot, hers and his, and she'd be damned if she let it slip away. Hey, if that train chase left you breathless, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss Ava's last stand. Drop a last train in the comments if you're holding your breath for Noah. Let's see if she catches him in time.